Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I thought I'd wait for still people loading on the Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's get started. Good morning or good afternoon to our audience joining from various parts of the world. My name is Paul Salim. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. Our panel today is something we've worked on a lot and we keep thinking about and coming back to as a critical issue in the Middle East, which is the issue of regional cooperation. And we're gathered here at a time when a new U.S. administration is taking over. So it's timely again to discuss this issue. With me to discuss it are a number of esteemed colleagues from the DC community. And this session was triggered by an article that Jim Zogby, who's with us here on the session, wrote in the National. And that article will be on the chat for you to look at. And it's, I'll give you the title of that. The title is Biden Should Think Big in the Middle East, where Jim says we must address the interconnected conflicts there as the equivalent of a regional war or regional/world war. That requires an international conference under UN auspices, and he goes on to outline many parts of that argument to the Biden administration. At the Institute, we've also published a lot on this issue, including a book called From Chaos to Cooperation that I co-edited with my colleague Ross Harrison. That'll also be in the chat for those who would like to take a look at it. Let me introduce our panelists and then get started. Jim Zogby is the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, which does tremendous work, obviously, with Arab American voters, citizens, very much engaged in electoral politics in the US. He's also engaged with the Democratic Party and a very strong voice there for Arab Americans and issues of that related to that. His second hat is the managing director of Zogby Research Services, which does excellent polling throughout the Middle East. And we've hosted Jim many times presenting findings from his polling research. As I mentioned, he recently wrote this article, which he will tell us about. Joining us from the UAE, from a different time zone, is our good friend Mina Al-Uraibi. Mina is the editor-in-chief of The National, the premier English language newspaper in the UAE, I would say in the Middle East. Mina has over 15 years of experience covering Middle Eastern, European, and American affairs. I'm pleased to welcome our good friend Barbara Slavin in the Washington, D.C. area. Barbara is the director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. She's a non-resident senior fellow there as well. She's also a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University and a columnist for almonitor.com. And last, certainly not least, our good friend Gönül Tol. Dr. Tol is the director of the Turkey program here at our Middle East Institute. She's obviously a senior fellow here as well. She also works in a new initiative that MEI has launched called the Frontier Europe Initiative, which looks at countries adjoining the Black Sea and how their interactions relate to the Middle East and relate to other global issues. Gönül too is an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Institute for Middle East Studies. I'll start with Jim, who will give us sort of the gist of his argument and his article. Then I'll turn to Mina for how things might be seen from the Gulf. Then to Barbara about how they might be seen from Tehran, and to Gönül perspectives as they might be seen from a Turkish perspective. So, Jim, over to you. What are the compelling reasons? What are the dynamics? What do you put forward in your article?
Thank you, Paul. But just a slight correction in all due respect to MENA, the article was in The Nation here, not in The National there. But
I'm too excited about MENA's newspaper, The Nation.
The Nation magazine here. Look, I was going to start by recapping some of the history in the region that brought us to where we are, starting with the disastrous Iraq War. But let's just say that if you look at the last 2 decades, what we've seen is an unraveling of the Middle East from a fragile but relatively stable region to one which I believe, and you quote me correctly, as being embroiled in what amounts to a regional world war. It's not at the level of the 2 great wars that wrecked Europe. And I always need to mention that when people start talking about the bloody Arabs or the chaotic Arabs or the unstable Arabs, I say, let's go back a century and look at Europe. Literally tens of millions killed, and horrific conflict and genocide. That's not what we see, thank God, in the Middle East. But there is this incredible unraveling that goes from the Libya, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and also the waters now in the Eastern Mediterranean and around the Red Sea into the up into the Gulf. The reason why I say that it's a regional war is because it's not just individual conflicts, but if you look at them, they're all connected, and they're connected in ways that involve a common set of external players. Either some seeking advantage or others seeking to deny others advantage. There are 2 of the players, Turkey on the one hand, Iran on the other hand, who have broader visions of seeing themselves as sort of regional empires of the past, wanting to recreate that in some way. They have bigger ambitions. And then there are others who are in a more defensive mode, concerned about the quest for hegemony of those 2. I remember during Lebanon's long war, we used to lament the Lebanese sectarian factions while they were at the root of the conflict. External players who entered into the conflict, either because the sides sought support or they became vulnerable and needed support, Lebanon became a vacant lot and a playground where regional players carried out their ambitions. That's pretty much what's happening in each of these conflicts. In the Middle East, you have the US, you have Iran, you have Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and even Israel, as I said, seeking advantage or seeking to deny others the advantage. The problem is that we've been playing something amounting to whack-a-mole with each of these. Obama thought, we're going to stop Gaddafi marching on Benghazi, and so we bombed. But it wasn't just the bomb. We sustained an effort that resulted in overthrowing him without anyone asking the question, what the hell would happen next? One of the things that happened was that Russia lost a secure place in the Mediterranean, which gave them more incentive to become involved in Syria, to give them yet another outpost. And now you have Russia and Turkey competing in Syria for advantage, and you have Russia and Turkey competing in Libya. When we did the Iran deal, I remember saying to the folks at the National Security Council, why are you spending all of the resources, all of the diplomatic energy and capital that America has to stop something Iran doesn't even have, when you're not focusing on what they are doing, which is meddling in countries across the region? And in our polling, that's what people in the Arab world would say. They weren't as concerned about Iran's bomb as they were about Iran in Iraq, Iran in Libya, in Syria, Iran in Lebanon, and then later Iran in Yemen. The point is that you can have a UN mediator in each country, but each one of those, as I say, whack-a-mole situations cannot solve the regional problem by itself. And so what I suggest is something akin to what we did during the Madrid Peace Conference, although we stopped too short. We brought everybody together, and then basically the pressure and the political engagement ended, and we let the parties to themselves, and nothing came of it. or what was done with the P5+1. But again, that was a great international activity, but it also stopped short of what the goals should have been and limited it to, as I said, a bomb that they didn't have. A P5+1+++ needs to occur in the region to create something akin to an OSCE. Now, will it happen? Will there be hardliners in different countries who will say, no way on any, I'm never sitting with those people. We're not going to do it. This is not. Yes, there will be. But the pressure that we can put, and I don't mean the US alone. The US has lost way too much credibility in way too many countries to be the leader in this. But there has to be a UN Security Council movement in this direction. And that will take jawboning too. And even if it doesn't occur, what I think the benefit will be is projecting a vision of the future for the Middle East that currently doesn't exist. I remember years ago, one of the guys who was in that rotating presidency of the Syrian National Congress came to my office and we were talking about what they were doing and what they weren't doing and what was happening and not happening. And it was, conversation didn't go anywhere. And then he walked to the door as he was leaving and he stopped and he turned around and he said, where do you think we're going to be in 20 years? Where's the region going to be in 100 years? And I said, come on back, we need to talk. And we did. That sense of projecting a vision of the future, a Middle East that has stability, that has security, that can invest. I mean, this region invests less in itself than any other region of its kind. It trades less within itself than any other region of its kind. In our polling, what we find, the two top priorities in the last poll that we did were regional trade to promote prosperity and regional unity to promote stability. That's what people want. We'll listen to them, and projecting a vision coming from the P5+1+++ will, I think, ignite imagination and will also inspire leaders. There will be leaders in different countries who will say, that's the direction we need to move in. Will it happen right away? No, but to begin to see the region as a region, to begin to see the need to solve individual problems, but solve them collectively and create a regional security framework. People would say, well, you can't have Iran and Saudi Arabia sitting down across each other at the table. They're not ready, but they are ready to be fighting each other under the table. I mean, the point is that there has to be a better approach to this. And it's not just Yemen. It's not just Syria. It's not just Iraq. It's not just poor Lebanon. It's all of them together. And we have to have if we have a global vision of the conflict, then we have to have a global vision of the solution.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Jim. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, as you say, the region it's in, you could call it, it's a regional civil war, which then draws in global powers, call it a regional war that is also worldly. Many people described World War I and World War II as the European Civil War that went on for 30 years. And I definitely agree that where the people need to get is away from wasting resources on conflict and division, particularly when we're going, reminded of, in pandemics and economic contractions and what's coming in climate. I mean, who has the time for this kind of wastage of resources? Let me turn to MENA, picking up on a number of things that Jim said. Obviously, the UAE in particular prides itself on having a vision, on focusing on prosperity, all of that. It has made a tremendous historic breakthrough of turning a 70-year-old conflict, just breaking through it into normalization with Israel. People criticize people, but it was a visionary, bold step. And it's, looked to for this, it went to Mars last week. So certainly thinking of the future, thinking of a different Middle East. At the same time, the UAE is, when people critique, say, well, yes, but even the GCC has become divided and there's issues there, and there was the Yemen war. And but walk us through, how do you think, particularly the Emirati leadership, is gearing towards a long-term future, given that, being in a region which is perpetually at war,
Mm.
is not a good look for a tiny country so close to Iran that really wants to go places. So what's their vision? How do they get there?
Thanks, Paul. You know, when we think about the UAE, some of the interesting things happening, in addition to, of course, the Mars mission, Abraham Accords, and other things, is that this year they celebrate 50 years of being a union. And it is based on a federal system. And I often tell people what they don't understand is this is actually the only functional federal system that you have in the Arab world. And it actually can create a model in that sense of allowing for differences between different emirates and very specific ways of doing things, but at the same time, having common cause, common projects. And sometimes, you know, people say, oh, the UAE supports, for example, in Iraq, it supports the breaking away of Kurdistan, for example. And that's actually not true, but they do believe in this idea of regional governance and then also having a federal system. So that's one thing I would say in terms of if we're going to look at models for the region. While I think a regional order is hugely important, we need nation state orders. And that's something that's really important. I would say, again, as an Iraqi, that it's not just been the last 2 decades, and not just 2003 war, really from 1990, we are living through the anniversary of the 30 years since the liberation of Kuwait, that invasion of Kuwait, and that kind of idea that you could have a leader that thinks they'll go into a country and just take it, and that there's no real accountability, and then everything that happened since then. But also what happened after that in Iraq was that suddenly you had the Kurdistan region was seen as a safe haven, and you had parts of Iraq that were no longer really under the rule of the central government, and so on and so forth. So this idea of what's happened in the last 30 years and the rise of non-state actors. In Lebanon, for example, you have Hezbollah and of course, militias in Iraq and other places where you have non-state actors. For a country like the UAE that's trying to see a stable region, looking at development projects, or looking at also, you know, the future, the post-oil future requires thinking of new economic opportunities. And that's really hard when you have non-state actors breaking things away, of course, extremism, all the other elements. And so I would say between the rise of non-state actors, between the breaking internally of different countries, not having an agreed way of self-governance, and I do think federalism is one that would work in a number of countries in our region, geographic rather than ethnic or based on sect, but actual geographic opportunities. And the next is the idea of the nation state is really important for example, in the Gulf, where some of these countries are seen as young in their modern shape, but actually have a long history. And that's the case for all the countries of the region. It's very frustrating, for example, when you hear the foreign minister of Iran, you know, give an interview to Press TV a couple of weeks ago and says, you know, we are an empire of 2 millennia and the rest of the countries are not. And it's like, wait, hold on. Like, if you're going to be an empire, then, well, we can look at other countries in the region that have also had empires, but, you know, history changes itself. So this idea of how do they see themselves, these countries? And the UAE is a really good example of a modern nation state that, yes, tells you history is important and we must look back. And it's kind of amazing how they always talk about the founding father, Sheikh Zayed, and having this be a national icon, but then also having a way of looking towards the future and saying there are certain things where we just have to break with the past and turn a new page. And of course, you know, certain people will tell you, well, you know, they have the economic means to do it, but so does Iraq, so does Libya. You know, they have economic means, and look at what they're where they are. So what is the right, you know, what is the right way to govern ourselves, each of these countries, and based on that, have a regional order. I think having this idea of an international consensus on what happens in the region would be ideal, and it would be great. And it's interesting, again, you hear in Iraq, you hear in Lebanon calls for an international mandate. You know, Iraq is having its elections in October, and you have people saying the UN has to control the system because nobody believes in the national system. Okay, that's great, but at the same time, the international order itself doesn't work. You know, we've seen the UN Security Council fight it out over Syria, over Libya, and actually, if we're going to try to reform or form a regional order, we need to reform the international order that would try to do that, which I know makes the solution seem all the more complicated. But that's often what you hear from people in the region. It's like, yeah, okay, great. If we want to bring the UN to have some sort of role, But at the same time, look how divided the UN is and incapable of playing a role. And that's when countries like the US make a huge difference, but also other countries that today seem like they have more credibility. Norway, for example, Switzerland, people look to these countries and say, what fora could they create? So I think also the US would benefit a lot from those sorts of countries that actually have more credibility. I'm going to wrap up because I know we want to move on to other issues, but what I would say is COVID-19 and the impact it's had across the region really does present an opportunity. It's terrible, it's devastating, people have lost lives and jobs and so forth, but also it does represent an opportunity because there is a general sense from everybody you speak to, definitely in the Gulf, is that development, the economy, looking at soft infrastructure, looking at healthcare is a serious concern. This is no longer we're just going to postpone it. And climate is another one that I think there is actually much more credibility given to these issues than you'd have even 2 years ago. So I think that is an opening also for the US administration to bring people together, and energy, be it electricity, be it solar energy and so forth. Energy remains such an important issue for the people in the region. And again, the Gulf is interested in seeing, these are the sorts of projects they can get involved in and could actually bring people together as a start, rather than trying to solve all the problems. It might be a good entryway.
Thank you, Mina. But before I let you go in this first round, let me ask you specifically. The UAE obviously sits, right there next to the giant Iran, and it's a major concern. And it's opened up to Israel, demonstrating that it has, the vision and the whatever capacity and to overcome, historic differences, big ones. My question is sort of the UAE opening up and consolidating with Israel partly because it's given up on Iran in the sense that we just need to have a bigger defense and bigger fortress because there's no way we're going to find a way with Iran? Or is there any thinking in the UAE, who know Iran well, been neighbors for centuries, do some leaders in UAE see a pathway, a living pathway to de-escalate with Iran, to God, hopefully normalize in a way that's acceptable? Of course, everybody has issues about who's doing what, but are they giving up on Iran, or are they still trying? Of course, we'll hear from also what the Iranians might be doing, but what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think they've given up on Iran at all. Partly, the UAE, like you said, has historic ties with Iran, and never really wanted to break them all together. Again, COVID-19 was the first phone calls you saw Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, the UAE foreign minister, to make was to the Iranian foreign minister. There's been talk about the need to cooperate. And that was a way of saying, look, we have to find ways to cooperate. So I don't think they've given up on Iran. You saw, for example, when there was the attack on the tankers in 2019, which seems like ancient history now. The UAE was very careful to tamp down the rhetoric and say to everybody, okay, we need to find a way. So at all, I wouldn't say at any point that the UAE thinks, okay, there's no way of working with Iran. I think on the Israeli side, absolutely, there's a part of this that is deterrence, and that is saying that we have allies here. But there's also much more than that. Like, I know it seems that it's just a fig leaf or it's just covering, but there is genuine cooperation, healthcare, technology, looking at the economic opportunities. There really was, how do you leapfrog at a time when there are so many crises, leapfrog, and with Israel, they found that partner in the region. So it has geopolitical repercussions, absolutely, but it's genuinely not just that. And I think it would be wrong to put it through the prism of what does this mean for Iran? It has an aspect of it, but definitely is not the nucleus or the focus.
Thank you, Mina, and really thank you for highlighting a number of sort of main issues about a region. In order to be stable, needs to be a region of states, right? It's hard to stabilize with ISIS's and non-state actors and so on. And when you don't have states, that draws in regional powers, that makes things worse. And we're in a region where there are 3 or 4 places where there are not states, and that's a problem. A second thing that you highlighted, or that maybe links to something Jim said, comparing ourselves to Europe, it was much worse in Europe and then it got much better after World War II, is not only were they states, but they were states which actually came to a similar approach to governance, democracy in Western Europe, rule of law, and hence they were similar, and hence they was much easier to cooperate. which raises the question in the Middle East, even if you have states, can a monarchy coexist next to a republic, next to an Islamic republic? You know, ideology is a question mark. And then you raised the very good point that is becoming more urgently relevant is the outside in. How does the international community impact the Middle East? And we're coming again up to a point where global competition, like during the Cold War, is becoming very real again after maybe 20 years when it was just America. And the worry is if American-Russian competition is going to turn into more wars in the Middle East, or if, you know, Americans, Russians, Chinese, and Europeans can agree, like when they agreed on the JCPOA, we got progress. So this worrisomeness about the global powers either fighting it out in the Middle East or alternatively helping us come to agreement. I think that's a very powerful point. Barbara, over to you. Iran is a behemoth, is a big player in this region. They have concerns about their own security. They have ambitions in other places. They have intense ideological issues. They have very intense politics as well. They themselves have proposed regional cooperation and regional orders. So walk us through, how do you think, let me put it specifically, how could you imagine current Islamic Republic leadership reaching, through negotiation and other means, reaching a point where they are a secure part of a cooperative regional order, but one in which they do not have Hezbollah and other proxies and so on? And can they get there? Are they okay with that? Or is it, you know, is it too baked in at this point?
Well, first, thank you so much, all of you. It's a pleasure to see you, even if we're not in the same room, and to take part in this discussion. So thank you for that. You know, I think we have to prioritize. And I remember the Madrid conference, and it was a very useful forum for starting a number of discussions between parties who could not normally sit in a room together. But we have some existing fora and we need to use them. So, I mean, the first step is to get the Iran nuclear deal restored. And the Iranians have made very clear that nothing will move until that happens. And I think the Biden administration also understands that this is the first step to stop a very dangerous escalation in their program. You know, Jim asked why we focused on the bomb they didn't have. Well, the reason is because the Israelis were threatening to bomb the bomb that Iran didn't have, and put enormous pressure on the Obama administration to focus on the nuclear question at that time. So this is in part a legacy of that, but it is also, it was at least a successful format for reaching a multilateral agreement that, had Trump stuck with it, you know, might have led to better things. Certainly the fact that he left it produced nothing good, and it's created many more tensions in the region, the incidents in the Persian Gulf, problems in Iraq, and so on. So that's step one. Step two, and the Biden administration is already working on this, is to try to quell the fighting in Yemen to the extent possible, because that is the worst humanitarian disaster in the region. And if a solution can be found there, that would eliminate a lot of the irritation that the Saudis feel toward Iran, and hopefully would end the Houthi rockets, you know, coming across the border into Saudi Arabia and hitting airports and so on. I think that's really crucial. Beyond that, there need to be bilateral discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the UAE and Iran. We've seen more progress on the latter than the former. We have regional powers like Oman and Kuwait and Qatar, which have offered to help mediate some of these issues. I think the UN can play a role. The European Union perhaps can play a role with US support in terms of arranging conferences on certain discrete issues like COVID, like climate, like maritime security. And this would be one way of perhaps getting folks around the table. But I think you really do have to start with a nuclear deal. It won't be a magic, bullet. It won't solve all the problems in the region, but it might lead, for example, to a reduction in tension in Iraq, as well as facilitate a settlement of the Yemen war, which are urgently needed. The GCC needs to get itself in shape. I mean, the quarrel with Qatar was such a waste on so many levels. I'm not sure that the GCC can get its act back together as a functioning organization, but it needs to, and then it's in a better position, I think, to deal with Iran, to deal with Iraq, to deal with the outside powers if it has some cohesion. And of course, nobody has mentioned, Mohammed bin Salman. Is he capable of this kind of diplomacy and outreach? King Abdullah, under King Abdullah, there was a sort of détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia that followed the Khobar Tower bombings of 1996. There were understandings reached between negotiators such as Hassan Rouhani and Hussein Mousavian and various Saudis, and this agreement was blessed by King Abdullah, and it lasted quite a long while. So I think prioritize, start with the issues that we know we can perhaps work on, and then maybe build out from there, rather than have a big conference where it would be great, we could all see each other, and the hotels would love it in whatever city it was put. But I don't think we need a big gab fest now, with all due respect to Jim.
Thanks, Barbara. I mean, very much agree. I mean, the JCPOA in itself was a very important step, and I agree that obviously should be restored and reinforced. But also, I think the tragedy of abandoning it was sending the signal to Middle Eastern states that diplomacy and negotiation is feckless. Might is right. That forget diplomacy, forget negotiation, because it's not going to get you anywhere. And the pairing of walking away from the JCPOA and then on the Israeli-Palestinian front, reinforcing might is right, those taken together, I think, send signals to all countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. If you want something at this point, you got to go out and get it. Forget about regional order, forget about international. It's such a dangerous thing. Now, I agree, how much can we recoup and rebuild? But that's the direction we need to go in to reinforce that it's diplomacy, it's negotiation that gets you ahead, not war and seizing things by force. But I want to dig down a bit with you, Barbara, that when I talk to Iranian interlocutors pre-COVID, I mean, their threat perception, their existential threat perception is about the US and Israel. It's really not about, they don't fear Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Turkey. Their asymmetric warfare is against the US, and part of the asymmetric warfare against Israel is really against the US. That if you Americans think of bombing Iran, then we're going to bomb Israel and you're not going to like it. And of course, it's good for Saudis and Iranians to talk, and UAE and Iran to talk and fully agree on Yemen and all of that. But what partly complicates the matter is that Iran is effectively at war with America and Israel, and that war is rampaging throughout the Middle East. Obviously, Iran's presence in Lebanon has nothing to do with the UAE or with Saudi Arabia, nor its presence in Syria, et cetera. So that's just something to think about and how to unpack that part of it. The second thing, again, when talking with Rouhani, Zarif and other very reasonable, people from the Iranian government, still when it comes to groups like Hezbollah, or the whole idea that they really represent the Shiite Arabs, but particularly groups like Hezbollah, it's completely off the table. There's absolutely, they laugh when you mention that, that's never anything we can talk about. Now, I I fully get that, let's start somewhere and start with the JCPOA, and we must. But it's also very problematic that and we've had discussions led by our colleague Randa Slim, who runs our Track 2 dialogue with Iranians. And when you say, well, what's the Middle East that we would like to get to? We can agree on a lot of things, but when it comes down to some basics, like, okay, so what's the end game for Hezbollah and for your presence elsewhere? They say, no, well, that's not something we can go to. It's partly ideological and partly just baked in paranoia. I don't know any thoughts on that before I move to Gunil?
Yeah, I mean, I think that look, Hezbollah is a fact of life, and it has been for decades now. It's the dominant part of the Lebanese state. So, I think the focus should be on preventing transborder activities. So, not having Hezbollah as a combatant or a trainer, throughout the Arab world, controlling the spread of rockets and missiles from Iran and from Hezbollah to other parties, to the Houthis and to other parties. But Hezbollah's not it's not going anywhere. So I don't think we should set unrealistic expectations. If the general level of tension can be reduced, if the United States and Iran are no longer in this state of hostility, if at least they can restore the JCPOA, I think that diminishes the incentive for Iran to use groups like Hezbollah and to foment a lot of instability in these other countries. Iraq is a special case. I mean, clearly the militias there have their marching orders, which is to chase out American troops. And we have some fundamental decisions to make about our military presence in countries like that, and whether it's wise to have American troops still in Iraq, where they are a target, frankly, for these militias. But these militias are now part of the Iraqi state. They have support from the Iraqi government. They're part of the armed forces of that country. So some things we're not going to be able to unwind. But if we can reduce the overall level of tension, then the chances that these groups will be mobilized to attack American and other targets, hopefully would be minimized. One other point, if I may, and that is to praise the Abraham Accords, because it's very important that Israel be integrated into the region. And it's very important that Iran sees that its policy of rejectionism is increasingly unique to Iran and to Iran's proxies in the region. If we can diminish the Israeli paranoia, that might help to diminish Iran's activities and its paranoia as well.
Thanks, Barbara. I mean, I do think, though, that, it's exactly the facts of life, as you say, which have become the problem. And unless we imagine a different future, and unless Iran can imagine with us a different future, we're going to remain in these facts of life, and they're pretty horrific. But anyway, I'm going to turn to my colleague Gunul Tol. Let me tell the audience, please submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. I will be following that Q&A function, and I will put your questions as quickly as I can to our panelists. So please use that and submit your questions there. I know, Mina, you wanted to come in on something, but let me turn to Gunul. So Gunul, let's say in the past, Turkey was the future, right? I mean, in the past, Erdogan was saying, oh, we should all get along and we should have a regional order based on, respect for sovereignty and joint business interests and so on. Of course, Erdogan has come a long way and is now playing a different game. And you've written a ton on all of these issues. My question to you maybe is two parts. Could you imagine, with Erdogan still in power for how many years he is, does he have a pathway towards de-escalating? He, now has militias in Libya and place in Syria and place in Iraq and is taken the Turkish approach in a very combative way. Does he have a pathway towards pulling back that approach and going towards a more sort of, can he be a leader in that? And the second part of the question, is that something a post-Erdogan Turkey could look to play a role in, and how could Turkey be helpful, and how could it be harmful in this process?
Thank you, Paul. Well, it's really difficult because everything that Erdogan does on the foreign policy front is closely tied to his domestic calculations. And to Jim's suggestion, I think trusting a UN-led international conference to address the region's problems, that requires a lot of faith in diplomacy and the West. And I think Erdogan has no faith in either of them. From his point of view, there are two problems first with the UN-led initiative. The first one is the UN itself. Since 2011, he has been challenging the Western-dominated World War II order, and he's been calling for an overhaul of international institutions, such as the United Nations, because he really wants to give voice to nations other than the Western countries. So he even launched a campaign called "The World is Bigger Than Five." And he called for an overhaul of the UN, saying its Security Council had failed, it's ineffective, it had failed to address regional as well as global problems, including the Syrian conflict. And on many occasions, he basically slammed the Security Council's concentration of power, and he always promoted regional solutions to regional problems. And that line of thinking is I think, pretty much in line with the views of the nationalist coalition that he's leading at home. The common denominator of this coalition is it's anti-Westernism, and it's anti-Westernist and anti-imperialist stance, as well as its distrust of multilateralism. So this, I think, ideological orientation has become the main driver of Erdogan's recent, very aggressive, very unilateral, very militaristic regional policy. And I think the second problem is that Turkey is involved in many conflicts in the region, from Syria to Libya to South Caucasus and Eastern Med. And in all those conflicts, Erdogan sees the West, particularly the United States and France, as part of the problem, right? In Syria, for instance, US cooperation with the Syrian Kurdish militia is a problem that Turkey cannot get over with. And it's a significant source of anti-Americanism in the country. I just saw a poll yesterday that found an overwhelming majority of Turks sees the United States as the #1 security threat. And a significant majority sees Russia as a great ally. In the Eastern Mediterranean too, I think there's an anti-Turkey status quo led by European countries and supported by the US. And Erdogan thinks that the only way to break that status quo is to increase the cost of Western cooperation through a gunboat diplomacy. And Turkey's military presence in Libya is also part of that calculation. In the South Caucasus, Erdogan has been always critical of the Minsk group there and promoted a regional solution. And finally, he said diplomacy is never going to work. And he finally took matters into his own hands by militarily backing Azeris in the latest conflict. So I think but here the bigger problem, and this is an answer to your second question, the bigger problem is that, and something that suggests Turkey's problematic foreign policy moves are not going to disappear once Erdogan is out of the picture. Turkey's opposition, except for the Kurds, the pro-Kurdish party, backs this unilateral militaristic foreign policy approach. And of course, the other problem, which makes it difficult to lure Turkey into any regional arrangement, is that whatever Erdogan, again, does in Syria, in Libya, in Eastern Mediterranean is very much tied to what he wants to do at home. And that makes him really rigid in the way he sees regional conflicts. And the region itself is very skeptical about what Erdogan wants to do in the region. Qatar is about the only country with which Ankara has smooth relations. And that's why I think Turkey will remain a very problematic country in any effort to craft a regional approach to problems.
So what happened, Gunil, to that? I mean, of course, it's disappeared, but there must have been something behind that, no problems with neighbors, that old policy. There must have been real, obviously, Turkish economic interests and so on, partly with the Anatolian, tigers and the economic interests they saw. How does that if you just take the political economy of Turkey, aren't there still forces that would push Erdogan or somebody else who's in charge? I mean, you've explained very well how we've gotten into the combative position with the West, combative position in the Caucasus and in the Middle East and in North Africa. But where are the forces inside Turkey calling for, you know, a different approach? Are they just eclipsed? Is it because this is not great for Turkish business, Turkish economy, Turkish diplomacy? Is that disappeared or is it still there?
Well, no, it has disappeared, and this is, and even those, it's you have to understand that Turkey is a completely different country now. It's a one-man rule. There are not that many people around him who would even suggest, let's normalize ties with Egypt, for instance. There was this retired general who supports Erdogan's nationalistic vision in foreign policy making. He suggested, why don't we, instead of clearly in the Eastern Mediterranean, we are very isolated and the West is never going to understand our part of the story. So why don't we talk to the regional countries like Egypt, Israel, even Syria? And there was such a backlash against that idea that I think the problem here is that the zero problems with neighbors policy worked perfectly well until the Arab uprisings. But that was a time when Erdogan was still very cautious in foreign policy because his secularist rivals were still, to a large extent, calling the shots. So he wasn't secure. But by 2011, and that overlapped with the Arab uprisings, he had consolidated power, he had sidelined his secularists, and he had a different vision. And that vision was Islamization at home and supporting Islamist movements in the region. And that worked up until 2015. And when he realized that that didn't deliver, because at home, that Islamist coalition could not deliver him what he wanted, which was switching to a presidential system, he switched to an alliance with the nationalists. So whatever he does, you really have to look at this very strict, rigid ideological coalition he has, and they call the shots. And no one is at the moment is calling for, except for a few voices in the opposition. Everyone thinks that Turkey is surrounded by enemies. The West is part of the problem. And in the region, you have to do whatever you want to do, you have to use your military means. So that's the general mood in the country.
Well, clear, depressing, but clear. We have 15 minutes left. I'm going to go to questions on the Q&A function. I apologize, we might not be able to get to all of them, but let me throw them three at a time and take notes, whoever would want to respond. Some of them are directed to certain people, but I'm going to give three at a time. So first question from Jeffrey Caldwell, maybe for Barbara. When Obama released several billions of Iranian assets, at the beginning of the JCPOA, did that reduce Iranian extraterritorial malign activities? And let's link that to sort of a broader question, Barbara. If again, we have the JCPOA and then they get some more money, obviously, that the criticism is, oh, they're going to, table that question, and anybody in addition to Barbara can respond. A question from Timur Dardiri. Maybe this is to Jim, but could be others. Post-World War II Europe was mentioned as an example. We've seen different models ranging from the OSCE and the Council of Europe, European Union, but other regions have done other things. I might mention ASEAN and other examples in Africa and South America. Which model would be most suitable for the Middle East, and which elements would need to be very different from what was done in Europe? Third question for this round from Solomon Vinay, or a comment: unless the US has a clear, stable policy towards the Middle East, especially towards Iran and Hezbollah, there will be no real peace, I suppose, and prosperity in the Middle East, especially in Lebanon and Palestine. So that's a question from Solomon. Maybe Barbara, go to you first, and then Jim, and then others.
Sure. Yeah. Let me take the asset question. during the period of the negotiation of the JCPOA and right after, Iran was actually working with the United States indirectly in Iraq against the Islamic State. And I don't recall that there were attacks on American troops in Iraq or American contractors in Iraq during that period. But I think in general, what we've seen is that Iran's alliances with these groups are largely impervious to how much money it has. You know, Ken Katzman, who is with the Congressional Research Service, who's followed sanctions policy for a long time, notes that, you know, that Iran's influence increased during the initial period of multilateral sanctions supported by the whole world against Iran. You know, in the 2010, 11, and 12 period, Iran was reacting to the Arab Spring and taking opportunities as it could. And we've seen, of course, since Trump pulled out of the JCPOA and imposed, you know, maximum pressure, so-called very draconian sanctions, that it hasn't dented Iran's regional activities. So, you know, I think it's at best or at worst irrelevant. At best, it could have actually a minimally beneficial effect, because it would reduce the irritants between the United States and Iran and the reason for some of the hostile action. But Iran has its own policies in the region. As Paul has noted, its alliances are largely with Arab Shia, who have been mistreated and discriminated against in their own countries. It's a long-standing policy, and it's not going to change.
Thank you, Barbara. Jim wanted to jump in, and of course, Mina and Gunil as well. But Jim, you're on mute, Jim.
Two things. One on polling. Barbara's absolutely right about the role that sanctions play or don't play in altering behavior, especially what we find is that people suffer from sanctions. Regimes don't. Additionally, I think, though, that there's a confusion that sanctions turn people against the regime. They don't. They actually move the other direction. And what we find in the polling is that when the JCPOA was signed, and I'm a bit of a John Kerry character here. I was against it before I was for it. I ended up, when I looked at the polling after it was signed, and I saw that Iranians actually turned against the government, they said when we asked them what they wanted the money that they were going to get invested in jobs. They wanted greater protection for civil liberties, et cetera. And when we asked them, as we do every year in our polling, their attitudes about individually Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, the numbers dropped precipitously for do they want their government involved in those conflicts. With Lebanon almost falling through the floor. I mean, there was like no interest in Lebanon at all, much more so in Iraq. A little bit, not so much in Yemen, but in Iraq and Syria, they saw those as priorities, but the numbers dropped 30, 40%. As soon as Trump enters and they get canceled, people turned against turned toward the government because the biggest enemy, America, was attacking. And they all of a sudden they were supporting involvement in Lebanon, involvement in Yemen, involvement here and there, and the issues of civil liberties dropped off. So I think that's a factor here. There are ways you can alter behavior, and Barbara's right. I mean, the negotiations do begin the process of changing people's behavior. Maybe not the regime so much, but they do foment dissent from below. With regard to the model, it's true that you have quote unquote republics and monarchies and a whole bunch of dysfunctional governing systems in the region. I mean, Libya, Yemen, Syria, etc. But Europe was no piece of cake when the OSCE was initialed. Granted, you had an American superpower, right? But you also had Russia. You had two diametrically opposed, hostile forms of governance that created a stable environment that, while it wasn't perfect, lasted a generation until the Eastern European situation was able to transform from within. Who leads? I don't know. Does it happen? I don't think it's a gabfest, Barbara, as much as it is an initiative to create an alternate vision and to invest people in that vision and to begin a discussion about there's a way forward in the region. We don't have to be stuck with unraveling the onion or peeling away the layers of the onion in Yemen and trying to figure out what the hell you do in Libya, and are you ever going to solve Syria in any way, shape, or form? And I'm not ready to surrender Lebanon to Hezbollah. I mean, that's a disaster. There are complex problems, but there has to be a discussion about a way forward. Is there an alternate vision? And beginning with the notion that a non-aggression framework where every country can say, we will not attack, you will be secure within your borders, but it is unacceptable for you to expand beyond your borders. Will every country accept it? No, they won't. I don't expect the Islamic Republic to say right away, oh, sure, that's what we'll be secure and you won't touch us. That's not going to happen. But it puts it on the table as a framework of what's possible moving forward. And just as, you know, the vision of what the UAE represents in terms of this. I mean, when we do our polling, MENA, in the UAE, we have to segment out the populations. There's maybe 300,000-400,000 Iranians that have to get factored in when you're doing a nationwide poll, living mostly in Dubai and Sharjah, but it's a huge population. The UAE has this, it's not just Emiratis, it's this complex society that has really done quite remarkable things. I've said it's sort of like the way America was seen in Europe, turn of the last century. You know, the streets are paved in gold. If you're an enterprising young Syrian or Lebanese or Egyptian and you've got an idea, that's the place you go. That's the place you want to go. That vision can be regional, but there needs to be a forum to project it. That yes, Iran, you can invest. Yes, Egypt, you can have a new economic future for yourself. Yes, Libya, there's a way we can reconcile and stabilize. But if people aren't sitting and gabbing about it and projecting a vision about it, then there's no place to hang your hat. There's no way out. And we end up then getting involved in the muck of each individual conflict that become dead ends in and of themselves, or like the balloon, you solve one someplace and that provokes somebody to then say, I need to secure advantage elsewhere because I'm losing in this one, which is what we've seen in too many of the cases. Turkey feels it's losing here, so they got to go there. Iran is stymied here, so they go there. And using, you know, regional proxies for their advantage or trying to stop the advantage of others. Mm-hmm. Getting it out, being able to talk about it and projecting an alternate vision, I think is critical. And that's kind of what the region needs right now.
Thank you, Jim. We're running out of time, as I'm going to turn to the last words to Mina and Gunul for your last thoughts and comments. Mina.
Thank you, Paul. I just wanted to react to something that Barbara said, which is that the militias in Iraq are chasing out the Americans. The Iranian-backed militias in Iraq are targeting Iraqis first and foremost. And we have had over 750 Iraqis killed from the protesters, some by the security forces, but the vast majority by militias. Kidnappings are going on by the militias, and they have an ideological belief. There are divisions within the Iraqi Shia population and within the Iraqi Shia militias. And some believe that Iraq should be taking its marching orders from Tehran or from Qom. So I think it's really wrong to put it as if the Americans left Iraq, then the militias would put their arms down and say, you know, yeah, we were just fighting Americans. That is just factually wrong. So I have to push back on that because I wouldn't want people to leave thinking that. The second element about the militias is that like Hezbollah, yes, they're a bitter fact of life, especially when they're targeting civilians and people and also military bases that are at the end of the day, for example, in Iraq, they're Iraqi bases. And so that is, yes, a fact, but that needs to change. And then thirdly, I'd say about militias being part of the state, whether Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese state or militia is part of the Iraqi state. I mean, again, that is undercutting the state, actually. So a lot of these militias undercutting the state. And until we fix that, it's really hard to see Iraq stabilize or Lebanon stabilize or Syria stabilize. And so when we talk seriously about wanting to change the direction of the region or having a regional order that people can work with, we cannot accept that arms remain in the hands of people who do not respect the idea of a constitution or a state. There is no way we can go forward. So, and that is the reason most people will argue, please don't just talk about the JCPOA and say this other stuff continues and we'll just try to manage the crisis. Managing these crises has led to them actually continuing. We need to solve them. And that takes courage, and that takes also a decision to say we need this non-malign activity and the undercutting of sovereign states in the Arab world.
Thank you, Mina. Gönül, last words to you. I might almost also mention one of the questions was about Turkish-Iranian tensions. Are they rising? How does that affect things?
Yes, and there was also another question about whether Turkey could become a model again for the region. Well, it took 8 decades for Turkey to have a constructive relationship with the region. It took an Islamist-rooted party that sought, like the AKP, that sought EU membership as well as better relations with the Middle East, and the Middle East welcomed Turkey because it was a Muslim country that was in peace with its Muslim identity. It is a functioning democracy, growing economy. So that's when we started talking about Turkey as a model. But Turkish model died in Turkey. No one can now talk about the Turkish model credibly. And also Turkey's actions during the Arab uprising further eroded that trust. So I think first Turkey has to get on its feet, rebuild institutions, and it's not going to happen. Even if Erdogan is out of the picture today, it will take at least a decade to rebuild the country, and we can talk about a model then. And the second question is whether the relationship between the state of the tension between Turkey and Iran could lead to better US-Turkey relationship. There are just so many problems in Turkey-US ties, and I think the most critical of them from the US perspective is Washington's worry that Turkey is getting way too close to Russia, and the S-400 question is the number one problem. The Biden administration is very clear on that. The Trump administration provided an alternative model, maybe an in-between solution. Turkey didn't take it. Now the Biden administration has a clearer stance, which is you have to remove the S-400s from your territory. Otherwise, we're not going to be on the same page. And it's really difficult for Erdogan to do that in a safe, face-saving way. And there are so many other problems, I think, and I think in Washington, the understanding is that this has to be a transactional relationship. That's been the mood since Obama, by the way, I think, and this administration, given the fact that there are so many people who work under Obama who are now in Biden's Turkey team, there's no appetite to reset this relationship. Biden hasn't called Erdogan yet. And I think that's telling. And the US priorities have shifted. There's Russia, you have China, Iran, and others. And I think Turkey is not there. And the US in the recent years has taken steps to replace Turkey. This growing US-Greek partnership is an implication of that. And also, the US is investing a lot in the base in Jordan, for instance. And I think one of the reasons is that so the US doesn't really rely on the base in Turkey. So all these steps are telling me that the US is now at a point where it says we should not rely on Turkey. The problems are too big to be fixed. So let's keep it transactional.
Thank you, Gönül. We've run over time. It's an ambitious vision. It's something that most people you talk to in the region would like to get to a region which, like other regions of the world, is not at war with itself, has functioning nation states, that respect national sovereignty, and it's focusing on trade and investment and growth and whatever is good for the people. But the realities are very, very dim and very grim. Maybe we can end by saying maybe it's darkest just before the dawn. I imagine nobody in 1942 in Europe imagined that things would turn out differently in just a few years. But thank you, Jim, for being with us today, for the article you wrote. Thank you, Barbara, for joining us. Of course, thank you, Gunud. Thank you, Mina, for joining us all the way, not from Mars, but from the UAE, which we're thrilled to have you. And thanks to the audience for being with us. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but the panelists saw the questions. We will share them with them, and perhaps they could answer separately. Thank you, and have the good rest of